My daughter refused to come to the hospital when I was on the verge of death because she was celebrating her husband's birthday. "I'm busy," she said, even though the doctors begged her to hurry. 2 weeks later, I called the bank and did what I had to do. After which, my daughter burst into my house in a panic, but I had already made my choice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The steady beeping pulled me back from somewhere dark and distant. My eyelids felt heavy as concrete blocks, and when I finally forced them open, harsh fluorescent lights stabbed through my skull like needles. A nurse's voice echoed faintly in my ears, calm yet urgent, as if she was holding my fragile life in her hands. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was alive or floating in some space between life and death. When I tried to speak, my throat felt scraped raw, as though I had swallowed sand. The words barely formed, but I managed to whisper a broken sound. Machines blinked at my bedside, wires curled around my arms, and a deep ache throbbed in my chest. It was a pain unlike anything I had ever known, not sharp but crushing, as though a heavy fist was pressing into me relentlessly. I realized then that I was in a hospital, surrounded by walls too white, too sterile, the kind of place where time slows down and lives are measured in heartbeats. A doctor soon arrived, his expression carrying the weight of knowledge that could shatter or heal me. He explained the heart attack, the severity of it, the thin line I had walked between life and death. His words were clinical, but the undertone was clear. I had been closer to the end than I dared imagine. The days blurred together in that hospital room. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting medications, and offering reassurances that sounded rehearsed. Each night, as the city outside lit up, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice had led me to this solitary battle. And then came the question, did I have family to call? Someone who could be there in case my condition worsened? The doctor's tone was careful, but I heard the real meaning beneath it. If you die tonight, should we let someone know? My chest tightened at the thought, not just from illness, but from dread. I gave them my daughter's name, Agnes. My only child, the person I had built my life around. Surely, she would come. Surely, she would care. But when the doctor returned, his face told me everything before his words did. He had spoken to her, he said. He told her the situation was critical, that I might not make it through the night. And her response was simple, cold, almost cruel. She said she was busy. It was her husband's birthday. She couldn't leave the party. The words echoed in my skull like a hammer. She was busy. Birthday party. Couldn't leave. Even as my life slipped away, I was nothing more than an interruption to her celebrations. I wanted to believe there was a mistake, that the doctor misunderstood her tone, that perhaps she didn't grasp the seriousness. But deep inside, I knew better. I had seen this side of her before, the selfishness, the priorities always shifting away from me no matter how much I had given. This time was simply the most brutal example. That night, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of the heart monitor. Each beep was a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, though my daughter couldn't be bothered. My mind wandered through decades of memories, each one a ledger entry of what I had sacrificed for her. I remembered the tuition fees I scraped together, the nights I worked myself to exhaustion so she could attend the university of her dreams. I remembered the wedding I funded, the grand event she insisted upon, even though I knew the man she married was a hollow promise of stability. I remembered every loan, every bailout, every compromise I made to keep her life afloat, while mine sank slowly under the weight. And now, at 68, as machines kept my damaged heart beating, I realized what my sacrifices had truly bought me. Not love, not loyalty, just absence, just silence. The following days only confirmed what I already knew. Agnes called once, her voice thin and distracted, as though the effort of checking in was too much. She asked about my condition in the same tone one might ask about the weather. She promised she would try to visit when her schedule allowed, but we both knew what that meant. Try meant never. Lying in that hospital bed, I began to see everything clearly for the first time. I had spent my life engineering solutions for others, calculating risks, ensuring stability. But when it came to my own daughter, I had engineered my own irrelevance. She had grown accustomed to me being the safety net, the unshakable pillar. And now that pillar was crumbling, she chose not to notice. But something inside me shifted during those long, sterile nights. Clarity hardened into resolve. If she could treat me as an afterthought, then I had the right to rethink what I left behind. I would no longer be the invisible benefactor, the silent provider. I would take back control of my life, of my choices, of my legacy. The idea came quietly at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind. A phone call to the bank, a question about revoking power of attorney, about rewriting a will. Practical steps, nothing dramatic. But beneath those steps was something deeper, something Agnes would never see coming. For years, I had been the dependable one, the provider, the sacrifice. But now, I would be the one who made the final choice. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in justice. And justice has a way of reshaping everything. The morning sunlight filtering through the hospital blinds felt different, almost like an unwelcome spotlight. My body was still weak, my chest tender from the attack, but my mind refused to rest. I had spent 3 days in this place, surrounded by machines that reminded me with each beep that my life was fragile. Yet the more fragile my body became, the stronger my will grew. I shuffled through the halls during my short physical therapy walks, nodding at other patients who carried the same vacant stares. Some were surrounded by loved ones, grandchildren holding balloons, spouses reading quietly by their bedsides. Others sat alone, like me, their only company the hum of machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant. One afternoon, I stopped at the doorway of an older man named Harold. He sat slumped in his chair, staring at a flower arrangement that was already wilting. We spoke briefly, and what he told me cut through me like a blade. His own son had taken his savings while he was in the hospital, drained every penny of the $35,000 he had worked for his entire life. All Harold got in return was a card, a shallow apology, and no visit. His voice carried bitterness, but behind it, I heard something worse, acceptance. He had resigned himself to betrayal. I returned to my room unsettled. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I realized Harold's story wasn't unique. It was just another variation of mine. Children who took without hesitation, who justified their selfishness with flimsy excuses, who believed that parents were eternal fountains to be drained. I wasn't just unlucky. I was part of a generation of parents who had given everything and received nothing but neglect in return. The next day, I met Eleanor, a woman recovering from gallbladder surgery. She spoke with a bitterness that mirrored Harold's. Her daughter had abandoned her during recovery, claiming her job was too important to take time off. Eleanor had put her through college, helped raise her children, and given every ounce of her energy. Now, she sat in the hospital garden alone, making plans to change her will and leave everything to an animal shelter. "At least dogs are loyal," she said with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her words echoed in my mind long after I returned to my room. At least dogs are loyal. The realization struck me like lightning. This wasn't just about my daughter failing me in one moment of crisis. It was about a lifetime of imbalance, a ledger that never balanced no matter how much I poured into it. For the first time in decades, I felt something close to freedom. I didn't have to continue this cycle. I didn't have to leave everything to someone who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. I could choose differently. On the 4th morning, I asked the nurse to bring me a phone. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the bank's number. The voice on the other end was polite, efficient, and entirely detached from the weight of my decision. Revoking power of attorney was a simple matter of paperwork, identification, and a signature. It sounded almost too easy, as if severing the bond that tied my financial life to my daughter was no more difficult than canceling a magazine subscription. But for me, it was a seismic shift. I ended the call with a strange calm settling over me. The process had begun, even if only in thought. Agnes didn't know it yet, but the world she believed belonged to her was beginning to slip away. Days turned into a week, and my strength improved enough for the doctors to discuss my discharge. They spoke of medications, diet changes, and lifestyle adjustments. They warned me against stress, though they had no idea that stress was no longer my enemy. Clarity had replaced it. Agnes called once more before I left the hospital. Her voice carried the same shallow concern, the same preoccupation with her husband's new business venture. She promised again that she would try to visit when things settled down. I let her words wash over me without response, my silence heavy on the line until she excused herself with a cheerful goodbye. That was the last straw. By the time I walked out of that hospital with a discharge folder in hand, I was no longer the same man who had been carried in on a stretcher. My body was weaker, yes, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. I no longer saw myself as a victim of my daughter's neglect. I saw myself as the architect of a new plan, one that would finally balance the ledger. Victor, the rideshare driver who picked me up, was a man with kind eyes and weathered hands. He asked about my hospital stay with the gentle curiosity of someone who had seen too much suffering to ignore it. His own father had suffered multiple heart attacks, and his siblings had grown tired of visiting by the third. "Family is complicated," he said with a sigh, his eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. His words struck me as both truth and warning. On the ride home, I stared out at the city, the skyline shrinking behind me. I thought of Agnes laughing at her husband's party while I lay in the hospital bed gasping for air. I thought of every loan, every bailout, every sacrifice that had built the life she now lived so comfortably. And I thought of how easily she dismissed me, as if I were an obligation she could reschedule. That anger no longer burned hot. It had cooled into something sharper, something more dangerous. It had become purpose. When I reached my house, the air felt heavy with memories. Every corner held reminders of sacrifices made, of a life lived for someone else's comfort. The family photographs on the mantel felt like mocking witnesses to my misplaced devotion. I set down my bag, sat in my worn armchair, and took a long, steady breath. Then I began making my list. Power of attorney, revoked. Will, rewritten. Beneficiaries, changed. It was simple, really. Numbers and documents, signatures and stamps. But each step represented years of silent resentment finally breaking through the surface. I imagined Agnes's face when she realized what I had done. Would she be shocked? Angry? Desperate? Would she finally understand what her neglect had cost her? The thought didn't bring me joy, but it brought me peace. And peace was something I hadn't felt in years. That night, I slept more soundly than I had since the heart attack. My dreams were not of hospitals or parties or betrayal. They were of empty pages waiting to be filled, of blueprints waiting to be drawn. My life, for the first time in decades, belonged to me again. And in the silence of my darkened house, I whispered a truth to myself that no one else would hear. Agnes thought she could take me for granted, thought I would always be there, thought my sacrifices had no end. She was wrong. The next morning began with silence. My house, once filled with Agnes's laughter during family dinners, now stood as an echo chamber of solitude. Yet in that silence, I found something I had been missing for years: control. I brewed myself a weak cup of coffee, careful with every sip, the bitterness sitting heavy on my tongue. My chest still ached, but it was not the ache of weakness anymore. It was a reminder, a steady drumbeat urging me forward. By 10 o'clock, I had gathered the documents from the desk drawer where they had sat untouched for years. The original power of attorney papers, neatly stapled, Agnes's signature bold and entitled on the bottom line. That signature once meant trust. Now it felt like a chain I was about to break. By noon, I walked into the downtown bank. The marble floors gleamed under my shoes, the air humming with hushed conversations and the mechanical clatter of printers. I waited my turn, my heart beating not from illness this time, but anticipation. When my name was called, I stepped into the small office of a woman named Michelle. Her polite smile barely masked the suspicion in her eyes when I told her why I was there. Revoking power of attorney, she repeated as if to confirm she heard correctly. Yes, I replied firmly. Effective immediately. She shuffled through the paperwork, explained the process, and slid forms across the desk toward me. My hand trembled slightly as I signed, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. With each stroke of the pen, I felt years of sacrifice lifting. By the time the last page was signed, the burden had shifted. My accounts, my savings, my future, they were mine again. As I walked out of the bank into the crisp afternoon air, I realized Agnes would feel the shift too, eventually. She would go to access what she thought was hers and find only walls. She would realize the safety net had been cut, the strings severed. For the first time, she would feel what it meant to stand alone. But I wasn't done. The following week, I met with Thompson & Associates, a notary and legal office tucked between high-rises in downtown Chicago. The receptionist guided me into a quiet room where the lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Caldwell, greeted me with a handshake that lingered just long enough to measure my resolve. "You're looking to make changes to your will," he said, adjusting his glasses. His tone was neutral, professional, but I could sense the curiosity beneath it. Most clients my age came in with family, children helping them make decisions. I had walked in alone. "Yes," I told him. "Immediate changes." We discussed the details, the language, the witnesses required. He asked about beneficiaries, charities, options. For years, Agnes had been the sole inheritor of everything I owned, my house, my savings, even my modest retirement accounts. But now, as I spoke with Caldwell, I realized how liberating it felt to imagine alternatives. A scholarship fund, a hospital foundation, an old friend who had stood by me when no one else had. The pen felt lighter in my hand this time. My signature, once again, reshaped the balance of my life. By the time I left the office, my will no longer tethered me to a daughter who had abandoned me in my hour of need. It was a strange mix of grief and relief, like tearing down a house you had built with your own hands because you finally admitted it was never a home. Walking back through the city streets, I noticed details I hadn't before. A child tugging at her father's sleeve for ice cream, a young couple laughing at a bus stop, an old man holding his wife's hand as they crossed the street. Small acts of love, of presence, of loyalty. The very things I had starved for but never received from Agnes. Each sight was both a wound and a balm. At night, in the quiet of my home, I allowed myself to replay the conversations with Harold and Eleanor from the hospital. Their stories of betrayal had sounded like laments at first, but now I saw them differently. They were warnings, signals of a generational shift where children had learned to take without ever learning to give. I wasn't alone. And if I wasn't alone, then maybe, just maybe, my actions weren't cruel. They were necessary. It was around this time that Agnes called again. Her voice was cheery, almost too cheery, like someone performing concern for an audience. "Dad, how are you feeling?" she asked, as though the answer mattered only in passing. "I'm better," I replied evenly. "Back home." "That's great," she said quickly. "Martin's new consulting project is really taking off. We've been so busy, but we'll come by soon, I promise." Her words were smooth, practiced. I could almost hear Martin in the background, laughing with someone, the clink of glasses echoing through the receiver. They were hosting again, entertaining again, living the high life that my sacrifices had bought them. I didn't argue. I didn't ask when. I simply told her I needed rest and ended the call. As the silence returned, I smiled faintly. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for her to keep a promise. I wasn't waiting for anything from her at all. The days that followed were filled with deliberate actions. Each phone call, each signature, each step was another brick in the wall I was building between myself and the daughter who had shown me what my life truly meant to her. I reorganized my files, wrote letters to old colleagues, even reached out to the hospital foundation about donations. With every decision, I felt the engineer in me come alive again, drafting blueprints for a future where I wasn't a footnote in someone else's story. But the silence couldn't last forever. The knock finally came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then grew sharper, more demanding. I had been expecting it for days, perhaps weeks, but when the sound echoed through the hallway, my chest tightened as though my heart was reminding me of the stakes. I rose slowly, my body still fragile, but my mind steady, and opened the door. Agnes stood there, dressed impeccably as always, her expression a mixture of worry and something else I could read instantly, calculation. Behind her, Martin lingered by the car, tapping at his phone, too disinterested to even join her. "Dad," she said quickly, her voice pitched higher than usual. "I came as soon as I heard." "Heard what?" "Agnes," I asked calmly. She faltered for a moment, her polished mask slipping just slightly. "The bank," she admitted finally. "They told me I no longer had access. I was worried. I thought maybe something happened, that you were making rash decisions." Her words dripped with a mixture of feigned concern and unveiled frustration. She wasn't here because she missed me, or because she feared for my health. She was here because the safety net she had always relied on had vanished. I stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The house felt colder with her presence, the walls echoing memories of holidays past, when laughter had filled the air before it had soured into duty. She sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Dad, she began carefully, you know I've always tried to help manage things for you. You don't need this stress. The bank, the bills, the paperwork, it's too much. That's why we set up the power of attorney. You trusted me. I studied her, the daughter I had raised with every ounce of my energy, who now sat before me not as family, but as a negotiator trying to reclaim lost ground. I let the silence stretch until her composure began to fray. Agnes, I said finally, do you remember the night I called you from the hospital? She looked startled, her lips parting as though she had expected a different opening. Of course, Dad, I was so worried. No, I interrupted firmly. You weren't worried. You told me you couldn't come because of a party. You chose a glass of champagne and a room full of strangers over your father's life. Her cheeks flushed, whether from shame or anger I couldn't tell. That's not fair, she protested. Martin's clients were important. It was business. You know how it is. Business, I repeated softly, almost to myself. Always business. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the stack of documents on my desk, as if drawn there by instinct. She knew. I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady but cold. The power of attorney has been revoked. The will has been rewritten. Everything I have, everything I built, is no longer yours. Her eyes widened, the mask cracking at last. You can't be serious, she whispered, her voice trembling. I am, I replied. Deadly serious. For the first time in years, she looked at me not as her father, but as an obstacle, something standing between her and what she believed was owed to her. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her jaw set, her polished composure dissolving into raw desperation. Why are you doing this? She demanded, her voice sharp now. After everything I've done for you. I laughed then, a bitter sound that surprised even me. Everything you've done for me? Agnes, tell me one time, just one, when you put me before yourself. One time when my needs came before your convenience. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and for the first time, she had no answer. The silence that followed was the final verdict. She stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, her eyes flashing with anger. Fine, she spat, if that's how you want it. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to come running when you need me again. I nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at my lips. That's exactly the point, I said quietly. She stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a finality that shook the walls. Through the window, I watched her march back to the car, Martin glancing up only briefly before starting the engine. They drove away without looking back, the sound of the tires fading into the distance. For a long time, I stood there in the silence, the house finally mine again. No more empty promises, no more false concern, no more waiting for a daughter who would never come. The weight that had pressed on me for years was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in decades, freedom. I returned to my chair, the stack of documents on the desk beside me. My savings, my will, my legacy, all redirected to places and people who would value them, who would honor the sacrifices behind them. Hospitals, scholarships, shelters. Strangers, perhaps, but strangers who might understand gratitude better than my own flesh and blood ever could. The heart monitor had once counted down the beats of a dying man. But now, each beat felt like a drum of defiance, a steady rhythm reminding me that it wasn't too late to reclaim what was mine. I closed my eyes and let the quiet surround me. Somewhere in the city, Agnes was raging, plotting, convincing herself that I had wronged her. But the truth was clear, written not just in the documents I had signed, but in the hollow space she had left in my life years ago. I had given her everything, and in return she had given me nothing. Now, finally, the equation balanced. And in that balance, I found peace.